The Anunnaki presence on Earth has spawned and permeated every major ancient civilization since the last Ice Age. Our longtime viewers are likely familiar with the Archives Anunnaki God series that provides comparative analysis of the Sumerian Pantheon of gods with the cultures of Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, and Greece. All these civilizations were the result of the interactions between two off-world factions from the same homeworld named Nibiru. At the height of their presence on Earth, there were 600 of them, and they were led by two brothers, Enki and Enlil. The lineage of these two brothers is generally agreed upon as they first appear in the Mesopotamian records. And for the most part, the equivalencies of these Mesopotamian gods in other ancient cultures are well settled and agreed upon. However, there is one ancient culture that serves as an exception. The Norse culture of Scandinavia has been bypassed for the most part when it comes to comparative analysis with the Anunnaki. When most folks hear the word Norse, it brings to mind the pantheon of gods that have become closely associated with the Vikings. But the Viking Age lasted only from the late 8th century CE to the mid-15th century CE. This comparative analysis covers a period that goes much further back, before the Nordic Bronze Age, which emerged around 1700 BCE. It is this period of Scandinavian prehistory where we can begin making connections to the Anunnaki. Indeed, even Zecharia Sitchin did not go into any great detail about this time period in this region as it related to the Anunnaki presence on Earth. The good news is the archive has come across at least one researcher who has put forth a rather compelling treatment on this subject matter. Thomas Ashmore was a U.S. Air Force Special Intelligence analyst who published a fascinating article in Nexus magazine in 2014 explaining how the Norse gods fit in the Anunnaki puzzle. Before we analyze Ashmore's research, we believe it will be helpful to briefly review a very simplified version of both Enlil's and Enki's lineages. We begin with Anu and Antu. They had 4 children, Enki, Enlil, Ninmah, and Ba. Enlil was designated senior commander on Earth and ruler of the upper world, which consisted of Europe and Mesopotamia. Enki was designated senior scientist and ruler of the lower world, which was Africa. These two brothers went by many other names in other cultures. Enlil was known as El in Canaanite, Ahura Mazda in Persian, Shiva in Indo-European, Zeus in Greek, Jupiter in Roman, and Yahweh in Biblical Hebrew. Enki was known as Ea in Akkadian and Babylonian, Nudimmud in Sumerian, Owens in Hittite, Ptah in Egyptian, Vishnu in Indo-European, Poseidon in Greek, and Neptune in Roman. Expanding Enlil's lineage, we can see that he fathered Ishkur, Nannar, and Ninurta, and Nannar begot Utu and Inanna. On Enki's side, we can see that he fathered Marduk, Ningishzida, Damuzi, and Nergal. We also note Marduk's son Nabu. The genealogy of the Sumerian Pantheon of gods is technically much more complicated than this, but for the sake of simplicity, we are focusing on the gods who played a direct role in the events that led us to the creation of Norse mythology. As Ashmore points out, perhaps one of the very first questions someone might have is, how could the Anunnaki have been known by and have interacted with all these various civilizations over such a long period of history? The short and simple answer is that they had extremely long lifespans. One common perception that is based on the orbit of their homeworld Nibiru posits that every 3,600 years on Earth was equal to just one of their years. But as they stayed longer on Earth, the Anunnaki longevity began to diminish. And according to the tablets, at least one, Marduk, died a natural death. His body was preserved with oils and encased in a coffin in Babylon. His body was even viewed by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. As indicated by the tablets, his lifespan on Earth would have been around 331,000 years. Ashmore gives an excellent summary about the Anunnaki advancement across the globe. Quote, as humanity's population grew and spread out across the planet, the Anunnaki offspring from the original two leaders, Enki and Enlil, also grew. The Anunnaki Senior Council headed by Anu decided to grant lordships to their offspring in new areas. Enlil became the overlord of Asia and Europe, and Enki the overlord of Africa. The Sinai and the lands of what is now Israel were handed over to Ninmah, one of the two sisters of Enlil and Enki. The new lands of western South America, now known as Bolivia and Peru, became the province of Enlil and his sons, while the northern and eastern areas of Central America, Mexico including the Yucatan, became the province of Enki and his sons. Marduk took over Egypt from his brother Ningizida, who then took some of his followers to the Central American region. Marduk became known as the Egyptian god Ra. Ningizida became known as Kukulkan to the Mayans, and Quetzalcoatl to the Toltecs, and later the Aztecs. End quote. The mission of the Anunnaki on Earth was to gather gold and transport it back to their homeworld in order to help resolve an atmospheric catastrophe. In order to achieve this mission, Enki eventually designed a Homo sapien worker after genetically engineering the current hominid species on the planet. But, as the Homo sapien population grew, the Anunnaki needed to employ measures that would ensure its survival. These measures included the dissemination of knowledge about crop cultivation, land development, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy. In order to achieve cultural control, they introduced kingship to the humans along with priests and priestesses to indoctrinate the masses. As Ashmore explains, quote, some of the Anunnaki offspring were not satisfied with the realms that they had been given and decided to expand their empires into other realms through the capture of territory, causing bad blood between the two clans and massive wars. The main instigator of this bad blood was Enki's son, Marduk. To make matters worse, Marduk decided to marry a female human. Up to this point, sexual relations and interactions with the human women were strictly forbidden. The wedding announcement went out far and wide to include the Anunnaki workers who were designated to provide off-world support in transporting gold and supplies. This group was described as 300 strong and given the title Igigi, meaning those who observe and see. 200 Igigi were invited from Mars down to Earth for the grand wedding. End quote. Marduk's actions enraged Enlil, but they also stoked a long-held suspicion and resentment in the Igigi that the Anunnaki on Earth had been consorting with female humans. The 200 Igigi from Lamu showed up, but they were not really there for the party as it turns out. The leaders of Earth did not realize the true intent of the Igigi was to abduct and conjugate with the female Earthlings. This event was actually recorded in the Old Testament. Genesis 6, 1-3 reads in part, quote, when humankind began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful. Thus, they took wives for themselves from any they chose. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also after this, when the sons of gods were having sexual relations with the daughters of humankind who gave birth to their children. They were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. End quote. The natural conclusion here is that the Igigi were the Nephilim in the Bible. Enlil ordered the Igigi and their families back to Lamu, but Marduk informed them that survival on Mars was no longer possible. Enlil then declared that they could not stay in the Eden, and it was at this point in time that Enlil began plotting against Marduk and the Earthlings. The Igigi, now banished by Enlil, became followers of Marduk and Enki. Thus, the die was cast for succeeding events that would eventually lead to a northern migration of the Marduk clan. If we wanted to isolate a specific event that served as the catalyst for the Marduk clan heading to the northern region, it would perhaps be the marriage of Inanna and Damuzi sometime around 3100 BCE. Inanna, being the granddaughter of Enlil and Damuzi being the son of Enki, did not sit well with Marduk, and he came out in opposition of the marriage. Ashmore explains, quote, Marduk was so enraged by the marriage that he devised a plan to destroy it through planned seduction and betrayal. The plan worked so well that Damuzi panicked and ran away in the dark. He slipped and fell on some rocks, killing himself in a freak accident. This started a long and bitter war between Inanna and Marduk, which ended in Marduk's near death and finally exile by a council of the Anunnaki. The texts do not say where he went during his exile, but during this time he was known to the Egyptians as Amon-Ra, the unseen. We know from the text where he could not go, because many parts of the earth had been divided up. The places taken at the time were areas around the Mediterranean, Africa, Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and Central and South America. End quote. Sitchin in the Lost Book of Enki gives us a hint as to where Marduk may have headed. Quote, with Sarpanit and Nibiru to a land of no return he departed, to a place where horned beasts are hunted with wife and son he went. End quote. Ashmore concludes that Enki took his son Marduk and the Igigi followers with their spouses to northern Europe and the Scandinavian lands, and that Enki became Odin and Marduk became Thor of Norse mythology. The Igigi became all the other gods and goddesses in Norse mythology, numbering in the hundreds. Norse mythology is primarily attested in dialects of Old Norse, a North Germanic language spoken by Scandinavian people during the European Middle Ages and the ancestor of modern Scandinavian languages. Most of these Old Norse texts were created in Iceland, where the oral tradition stemming from the pre-Christian inhabitants of the island was collected and recorded in manuscripts. This occurred primarily in the 13th century. These texts include the Prose Edda, composed by Snorri Sturluson, and the Poetic Edda, a collection of poems from earlier traditional material anonymously compiled. According to Ashmore, quote, it can be gathered from the prose that there were slightly fewer than 300 gods and goddesses worshipped by the ancient Norse people in what is now Scandinavia. The description of the chief god Odin fits almost exactly with the Sumerian description of Enki. Odin was a seeker and giver of wisdom, fitting well with Enki the scientist. There were two god tribes, the Aesir and the Vanir, and Odin was the father god of the Aesir. These tribes sound much like the Anunnaki and the Igigi caste. The prose indicate that the two tribes quarreled and warred with each other. There is precedence in this from the Sumerian Assyrian tablets. The story is complicated, but there was bad blood between Marduk and some of the Igigi due to an internal rivalry between two Igigi brothers who married two of Marduk's daughters. One brother ended up killing the other in jealousy over his rise to prominence under Marduk. It was a true family catastrophe and laid the lines for both Igigi and Marduk followers to take sides and hold bitter resentments. Although the two stories, Norse and Sumerian, of the causes of bad blood are somewhat different, the similarity is that in both stories the underlying cause is a goddess wife spreading suspicion and strife in support of her own rise to power. This could well explain the stories of the Aesir and Vanir tribes of gods quarreling and warring in later times. According to the Norse prose, eventually the divinities became weary of fighting and decided to call a truce. End quote. Thor was the first son of Odin, which matches up with the lineage of Marduk and Enki. Through archaeological evidence, the veneration of Thor can be traced back as far as the Bronze Age, and his cult has gone through numerous permutations across time and space. Thor is depicted as the personification of thunder, and he was the principal deity of warriors and military strength. This also matches up with Marduk, especially in later periods after his return to Egypt. Thor's tendency was to act first and think later, which often got him into trouble and was another similar trait possessed by Marduk. Balder was also a son of Odin and husband of the goddess Inanna. Balder died in the Norse legends, which mirrors the Mesopotamian god Damuzi. Both deities share a description of being friendly, wise, eloquent, and gracious. Ashmore points out, quote, "Apart from this description, Balder is known primarily for the story of his death, which was also caused by mischief, but was not attributed to Thor, who would have been the mischief maker, Marduk. Instead, it was attributed to a mischief maker, Loki. In many ways, Loki seems to represent the ugly side of Marduk." End quote. Hermod is another son of Odin, but a minor figure in Norse mythology. Indeed, the Norse record is scant when it comes to Hermod, which seems to make him a logical candidate for the representation of Ningizida. During this period of exile for Marduk, Ningizida spent his time developing the Mesoamerican Olmec, Mayan, and Toltec civilizations. Thus, it makes logical sense that he would not appear prominently in the Norse pantheon of gods. When it comes to Enki's son Nergal, it seems that Tyr, the fourth son of Odin, is the most logical equivalency. Tyr is a Norse war god who compares well with Nergal, who is described in the Sumerian Akkadian texts as the one first to choose war as the solution. The tale of the binding of Fenrir is the only surviving account to feature Tyr prominently. The dreadful wolf, Fenrir, was only a pup, but he was growing quickly. The gods feared for their lives, so they endeavored to tie up Fenrir in fetters from which he could not escape. When Fenrir laid eyes on the chain that would eventually bind him, he was suspicious and declared that he would only allow the gods to put it around him if one of them would stick an arm in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. Only Tyr was willing to do so. When the wolf found himself unable to break free, he bit off Tyr's arm. In the Sumerian text, Marduk was betrayed by Nergal, who took sides with the Enlilites. Nergal aligned with Inanna against Marduk, ensuring his defeat and exile. Ashmore explains, quote, "When you consider that the Anunnaki deity Nergal took sides with the Enlil clan in the wars against Marduk, you can see how this might be an allegorical story to represent how the brother was fooled by the beast and paid for it. This also brings forward the question of whether the beast, Fenrir, was an allegorical representation of Enlil. Norse mythology indicates that Odin had two brothers, Vili and Ve. Some sources use the names Honir and Lodur. They are credited with making the earth and with creating humans. After making the earth, the three brothers came across two logs which they used to create man and woman. Odin gave them breath and life, Vili gave them brains and fillings, and Ve gave them hearing and sight. Vili, Honir, may represent Enlil, but in Sumerian texts there's no second brother of Enki. Scholars have variously identified Ve and Lodur with Loki and Freya, but consensus has not been reached on any one theory. The story of Odin's creation of the first man and woman fits well with the story of humanity's creation in the Sumerian text. However, instead of a story of logs, the tablets go into great detail about Enki's genetic manipulation and experimentation, which involve combining some of the Anunnaki's own DNA with the DNA of the Homo erectus ancestors found in southeastern Africa. Although this took an extremely long time to perfect, it explains completely the unexplained evolutionary jump in mankind from simple creatures to the Sumerian civilization, practically overnight in evolutionary terms. In this way, Enki/Odin did in fact give life and breath to the first man and woman. Enlil, on the other hand, commanded the cities of the Sumerian civilization. He organized the teachings of all the knowledge to pass on to the new humanity. This was out of necessity as much for the benefit of the Anunnaki. They had to teach a growing population how to take care of itself. Thus, he assigned teachers for all the necessities of a growing civilization. In essence, he was the one who gave them, as the Norse creation story expressed, brains and feelings. End quote. After an undetermined period of time, Marduk was pardoned by Anu sometime before 2000 BCE. According to Zechariah Sitchin in the Lost Book of Enki, quote, "From lands from the north, lands where great horned beasts are hunted, Marduk before his father Enki and his grandfather Anu came. Nabu, his son, with him was." End quote. Ashmore posits that the references to the north and great horned beast support the position that Marduk was exiled to the northern European region of Scandinavia, where the large red deer and elk are so plentiful. After Marduk's pardon, he returned to rule over Egypt as the god known as Ra. Marduk was still pissed with Ningizida, who had taken over during his exile. The two brothers opposed one another vigorously for over 3 centuries until Enki appealed to Ningizida to relocate. Ningizida departed for the land beyond the oceans, where he would later become known as the Winged Serpent. Ashmore summarizes, quote, "Marduk essentially returned to his previous ways of conquering new lands and fighting against the Enlil clan for more and more power. The wars continued and even worsened, but there came a time when everyone had had enough. Marduk eventually won out to get what he wanted, the position of supreme ruler. He set himself up in Babylon, which he had built. The Igigi followers were present for his inauguration, supporting the proposition that they followed him back out of the northern regions. Enlil and his clan left to complete their work in the lands beyond the sea. This refers to the metallurgy works at what is now known as Tiwanaku and Pumapunku alongside Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. Eventually, the order went out for all to leave Earth completely. According to Sitchin's calculations, this happened over a period between 610 and 560 BC, end quote. Ashmore concludes, quote, "Evidence points to the Norse mythology as one more case of the presence of the Anunnaki during the beginning of mankind's jump into a knowledge-based civilization. What started as an exile for transgressions against their own kind became the beginning of the pre-Viking and northern Germanic tribes' existence with the living gods. The period of their occupation in the Scandinavian lands cannot be exactly determined, but it most likely happened during an extended stay in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, and probably lasted for many hundreds of years. They likely used allegorical, fantasy-like tales to explain their seemingly magical powers to their worshippers, and these stories were passed down in poetic storytelling form before writing could be utilized. When the exile in Scandinavia ended, they left, never to return, leaving behind only the tales of their presence." End quote. The archive would like to thank our viewers for checking out this latest installment of the Anunnaki Gods of Ancient Civilizations. As with the other episodes, we understand that this comparative analysis may not be agreed upon by some viewers, and alternate comparative equivalencies of the gods in each culture may be surmised. We would like to hear from you in the comments section, and if you enjoyed the video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for future episodes.